Hello everyone. Today's video we relax with the story about a nameless girl who lives in a small village on the banks of the Nile, where everything is covered in hot sun and yellow dust. The girl only knows how to plant rice, grind grain, and pray every sunset. But on a moonless night, when the river water swirls strangely, the sound of drums and footsteps breaks the usual silence. Her fate takes a turn from which there is no turning back. They came unannounced, the temple guards, wearing black-painted masks and bronze shields, and no one in the village dared to breathe as they entered. The man at the head of the group pointed at her, speaking in a voice like the sound of crushed stone. "This person has offended Mat, the sacred order of the universe." She didn't understand. She didn't know what the offense meant, only that cold hands had bound her wrists and dragged her out of the warm clay house, where her mother was still cooking porridge from dried lotus roots. They didn't let her say goodbye. They didn't let her ask why. They dragged her onto a wooden cart, battered but powerful, and took her away from the village like a sacrifice, like a goat to be sacrificed. She spent the night huddled, her head banging against the sides of the cart, her eyes red with fear and dust. She saw the torches of distant temples, heard the Nile lapping at its banks, comforting, but also a reminder that no one could escape what the gods had decreed. When they reached Thebes, the center of religion and power, she was thrown down a dark corridor into the crypt of a great temple. No one spoke her name. She was considered nameless. Only voices murmured in an ancient tongue from behind the colossal statues, prayers and voices as deep as the desert wind, indistinguishable from human or divine. That first night, she did not sleep. Every sound was a start. Every breath was an unanswered question. She thought of her friends in the village, of the papyrus fields, of the thatched roof where her mother had sung lullabies every afternoon. But now all that was behind her, and ahead, there was no going back. She didn't know what her crime was. Maybe a mistake, stepping too close to a temple, a passing glance at a sacred statue, or a foolish comment in the marketplace, wondering why the priests got to eat while the villagers had to share every scrap of bread. In ancient Egypt, the rules didn't need to be clear, just that someone above them felt you didn't belong. On the second night, the guards brought her some water and a block of bread as hard as stone. She could not swallow it, but she had to. Otherwise her own breath would betray her before dawn. Someone in the next room screamed. A terrible scream, then silence, as if the person's soul had been squeezed out of its own chest. She shivered. The tiles beneath her back were so cold that they sent shivers down her spine. When she closed her eyes, an image appeared, not of the rice fields, not of her mother, but of another woman, dragged like her from some village. And she suddenly understood. She was not the first, and certainly not the last. When she was led outside to wash her face in the murky water, she saw a line of others, women, children, even old men, all tied up. She heard whispers among the prisoners. She was arrested for daring to look the priest in the face. And that one, for stepping on the shadow of the idol while sweeping the courtyard. The whispers were filled with both fear and helplessness. In the eyes of the gods, any mistake could be a death sentence. As night fell, she looked through the crack in the rotten wooden door and saw the stars. Each star was a soul, they said, but she did not know whether her soul would fly or be trapped forever in these cold stone walls. A small drop of water fell from the ceiling onto her cheek, cold and salty like a tear. She could no longer cry. The huge stone statues in the temple still looked down, unblinking, unmoving, but it felt like they were whispering, like silent accusations she couldn't refute. And that's just the beginning. As the stone door closed behind her, no more light entered. They pushed her down a narrow, damp stone staircase, where only the sound of footsteps echoed, as if they were descending underground. Each step was a reminder that she was leaving the world of the living. The stairs led to a long, airless corridor where the sound of the Nile and the sound of people could no longer be heard. There was only a pungent, damp smell, the smell of rotting stone, moss, and long-dead flesh. A guard brandished a torch, and the faint light allowed her to see that the walls around her were carved with grotesque images. Men kneeling before gods, punishments with iron hooks, severed tongues amid the indifferent laughter of the priests. Then they came to what they called the Chamber of the Forgotten. A low-ceilinged cell, deep underground, where river water seeped through the cracks in the rocks, keeping the floor wet. The walls weren't built to keep out water. They were built to keep people in. They threw her into a small, closet-sized cell and locked the door with a wooden bar across it. No explanation. In the darkness, she heard the sounds of others. Gasps, the choking sounds of someone's throat, silent moans, and occasionally hysterical laughter, as if someone had been here so long their soul was cracking apart. She curled up, arms around her legs, back against the icy wall. The water was ankle-deep, and every step was the squishing of soft flesh on slippery stone. Someone had scratched the wall with their fingernails until they bled, jagged, wordless marks. Maybe a message, maybe a last call for her mother. The next morning, if it was morning, she was dragged from her cell. Outside, a tall, shaven-headed priest in white linen gestured with his hand. No one said anything. She was forced to sit on a low stone slab, while the man stared at her face. No judgment, no pity. Just the blank stare of a living statue. Then they threw her back into the cell. No questions, no torture, no sentence. She didn't know what that meant, but she began to understand that silence was a form of punishment. When you don't know what you're being accused of, you start to blame yourself. Had she stolen an onion during a time of scarcity? Had she accidentally poured an offering of water on the ground? Had she wished the gods would just sleep for a day, so the villagers could decide for themselves? As night fell again, the water under the floor rose a little. It was colder than the night before, and there seemed to be something moving down there. Not rats, not fish. Whenever she closed her eyes, she felt as if hundreds of eyes were watching her in the darkness. Not human, but unsettled souls. A prisoner in the next cell began to whisper. It was a woman's voice, old and rough as sand. "We don't die from whipping," she said. "We die from forgetting our names." She was silent, but the words stabbed her like a needle. Yes, she had not been called by name for days. They had called her that one, or nothing at all. And in her heart, the name that had once made her mother smile, now it was only a distant echo. The next day, a group of priests came to inspect the prisoners. One of them, a young man, wearing the symbol of Seth, looked down at her for a long moment and said, "You will meet yourself again soon, on the other side of the world." He spoke softly, as if wishing her good night. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her trembling in fear. The third night, the people around her began to fade. Some died. No one took them away. They simply sat there, dead, in supplicant positions, eyes still open, staring up at the stone ceiling where the sun never shone. The smell of death began to permeate the air, and the dreams she had that night were not pleasant ones. They were bloody nightmares, where priests in wild dog masks pulled at her joints like cursed toys. One morning, the guards opened the door with a bang. They said nothing, but it was clear that they had come to take her away. Others bowed their heads, or looked away. Someone whispered, "May Anubis lead the way." But in her heart, she knew no god had come to take her. Just rocks, and water, and a road with no return. They led her through another corridor, longer, darker, and so cold that her breath turned to mist. No one touched her, but the guard's eyes pierced her delicate skin. Each step was a dry sound, echoing off the stone walls, carved with images of ritual sacrifice, bodies being cut in half, hearts being pulled out and offered, blood dripping into pools at the feet of the gods. Then they arrived. A low-ceilinged room, wall-stained with dried blood, a floor of damp dirt and straw. In the center was a large stone slab, a place where all the pain had been engraved. On it, frayed rope marks, fingernail scratches, and drops of blood that had not yet evaporated told the stories of those who had come before her. The priest stood in the center of the room, a tall man with braided hair and a long leather whip in his hand. No introduction was needed. No threat was uttered. It was all too obvious. She was forced to stand, her back bare, her hands bound to the stone pillar with barbed wire. Cold, burning, and then the first crack of the whip, not just on her back, but straight into her skull. She threw her head back, eyes wide, unable to cry out. The pain was unlike anything she had ever known. It did not burst forth, but ripped through her skin like soul claws. A second lash, this time soaked in salt. The whipper did not change his expression. The observer did not blink. She was part of the ritual, not a person. Her flesh began to tear, tiny pieces, but each one opened the way for the salt to penetrate deeper into her flesh. No one counted the lashes. Maybe 30, maybe more. She passed out, woke up, passed out again. Each time she woke up, she found herself curled on the dirt floor, her face covered in blood, her hair matted like moss. A young priest bent down, put his hand on her neck, felt her pulse. She thought he would help, but he didn't. He just breathed. "You're alive." Seth is not satisfied. Then came the blade, a bronze instrument, as long as her hand, with a worn wooden handle. Not for killing, for cutting. They started at the softest places, on the soles of her feet, where she wouldn't be able to run if she survived. They scraped the thin skin with slow, precise movements, almost ritualistic. There wasn't much blood, but it hurt so much that her head went limp, as if the air had been sucked out. She did not scream. She had no strength left. The scream was in someone else, in someone she had once been, and now there was only a breathing corpse, trembling from time to time like a candle in the last wind. Then a priestess entered. She was different, dressed in black, and smelling faintly of burnt resin. In her hand was a clay bowl filled with a viscous liquid, medicine or poison. She could not tell. The priestess knelt, touching her wound with fingertips as cold as marble, and she whispered, "You will live, because I need to see you hurt again." No one wanted her to die quickly. She began to understand. Death was not a punishment, but a reward. They kept her alive, just to prolong the pain, like someone melting a bar of iron until it was red hot, and then whipping it against stone until it was deformed. In the days that followed, she was uncertain whether she was awake or asleep. She was taken back to her cell, but her back was no longer against the wall. The slightest touch caused excruciating pain. She could no longer walk on her feet. The skin was peeling, the flesh was cracking, and each step sent a red wave shooting out from under her nails. One night, she saw a woman sitting across the cell, her eyes empty, her mouth cracked, but still smiling. She said nothing, just looked, and silently raised her finger to her lips, signaling silence. She wanted to scream, but couldn't. When she rubbed her eyes and looked again, the woman was gone. She didn't know if it was a ghost or a human, or her future self. Then, when dawn came, or something like it, the guards came. They carried no whips, no knives, but they carried gray shrouds. The young priest looked at her and said, "You have had enough. Now it's time for the gods to judge." She didn't know if it was the end, or the beginning of another round of torture. She only knew that in her heart, she no longer felt fear. Only one thing remained, wishing for it all to end. They didn't take her to court, because in ancient Egypt, not everyone was worthy of being judged. Some people were considered guilty simply by their presence. And she, a woman with no background, no wealth, no connections, was that kind of person. On the 10th morning of her capture, 2 guards dragged her from her cell. She could barely lift her legs. Blood dripped from cuts on the soles of her feet, leaving long red streaks on the stone floor. Her hands were bound with hemp rope, not tight enough to keep her from dying, but deep enough to bleed. They led her through another corridor. this one wider and higher, light pouring down from the cracks in the ceiling like golden spears. At the end of the corridor was a square room, with 4 colossal statues of gods guarding the 4 corners. In the center was a stone platform, where a white-robed priest sat on a wooden throne. On his head was a crown of ostrich feathers, the symbol of the goddess Maat, the embodiment of justice and truth. She knelt, or rather was forced to kneel. Her head hung low with fatigue and fear. The priest did not ask her name. He did not ask where she came from, or what she had done, or why she was here. Instead, he picked up a scroll of papyrus and began to read in a voice as cold as the desert night wind. This man has disturbed the order of Maat. This man has spoken disrespectfully to the temple, profaning the purity of the ritual. This man has disturbed the spirit of the gods by his arrogant behavior and his dirty eyes. This man has caused the Nile to cease to bless and the sun to burn for a moment in the hearts of the people. The words fell on her like hail on a thatched roof. Each word was foreign, cold, and utterly unreal. She had never offended anyone, never dared look directly at the statues in the temple, never said anything beyond polite morning greetings. But here, the truth did not matter. Here, her mere existence was enough to make people feel uneasy. When the priest finished reading, he did not ask her opinion. He looked up, his hands held out as if accepting approval from some invisible power. Then he said, "Horus needs no excuse. This man will be handed over to the guardian spirits of Saqqara. He will be carried away, at night, so as not to pollute the sunlight. He will not be buried. No name will be spoken. No prayers will be given. He will become dust without direction." It was called name blotting. In ancient Egypt, erasing someone's name from all records, all prayers, all words was the cruelest way to kill a soul. Not just death in the flesh, but death in memory, death in the afterlife. It was a death that would never be reincarnated. It was an eternal dissolution. She did not scream. There were no more tears. Each word the priest spoke was like a door slamming in her soul. Beside her, a priestess stepped forward, wearing a hyena mask, and leaned down to whisper in her ear. "They do not hate you. They just need someone to punish." And then it was over. No written record, no seal, no witnesses. She was dragged back into the stone cellar, but this time, she was not left alone. A guard handed her a rough cloth, not to wear, but to cover her head as she was led into the night. As she lay in the cell, she heard an old woman on the other side of the wall chuckle. "They are afraid of a poor woman. That shows how strong you are." That sentence, though small, was a rare ray of light in her heart, even though she knew that ray of light would not last long, because tomorrow night they would take her away, and not to a place of the living. That night, she had a dream. In her dream, she was walking through a field of black lotus flowers. The wind blew silently, and at the end of the path was a stone door, carved with the image of a swallow with its wings bound. Behind the door was a thick darkness, and a voice, like her mother's, but faint, said, "You must go, but you have the right to carry your name." She woke with a start. Her hand clenched the dirty cloth beside her. Even if they erased her name from the tombstone, from the prayers, from the world's memories, she still kept her name inside, right in the middle of her chest, where no blade could reach. And even if tomorrow her body turns to dust, her soul will still know. She once existed. When night fell, Thebes was silent. There was no singing in the temples, no children laughing in the alleys, no trading or arguing in the marketplace. The city felt different at night, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something sacred or terrible to happen. She was awakened not by a call, but by a jerk on the wrist. 2 guards stood there, no torches, no words. They tied her hands with soft rope, not too tight this time. She did not resist. Her body was used to being led. Only this time, not to the torture chamber, not to the courtroom, not back to the dungeon. She was led outside, for the first time in days of darkness. The night air was colder than she remembered. The scent of the Nile hung in the air, carrying with it the scent of silt and damp moss. She stepped barefoot across the cobblestones that led to the riverbank. A crescent moon hung overhead, like the half-closed eye of Thoth watching. At the riverbank, a small boat waited. No oarsman, no canopy, just a long log, floating silently at the water's edge. She was helped into the boat. A priest stood at the bow, touched the ground with his staff 3 times, then tapped the side of the boat, signaling it was time to set sail. The boat left the dock without any oars. The river, as if hypnotized, slowly carried the log away in silence. On both banks, large stone statues, Horus, Batet, Anubis, watched after them, wordless witnesses. She sat in the middle of the boat, her hands resting on her thighs. The wind blew gently through her hair, and the wound on her back throbbed with each beat, reminding her that she was still alive. In the sky, a few stars appeared, reflecting on the water like souls drifting side by side. The boat sailed on, through dark stretches of river, through reeds as tall as a man, past abandoned temples as silent as tombs. No one spoke. No one prayed. In that silence, all prayers became superfluous. After an indeterminate amount of time, perhaps an hour, perhaps all night, the boat touched shore. A small, deserted harbor, nameless, uninhabited. Only dark rocks and a path leading up the hillside, where the moonlight was no longer sufficient to illuminate it. They dragged her down, up stone steps to higher ground, where she saw the remains of people like her, an old burial shroud, handprints in stone, and a shallow pit roughly covered with dust and sand. She wasn't forced to kneel. She knelt on her own. The priest circled her, sprinkling black powder on the ground, a mixture of bone ash and earth from the ancient cemetery. He chanted ancient words, not meant for the living to hear. They weren't meant to be a prayer, but to cut off her presence from the world. Then they tied her feet, laid her down in a rocky trench. No coffin, no burial, just a small stone statue of the god Ammit, a cross between a crocodile, a lion, and a hippopotamus, placed at her head, as if to frighten her troubled soul. The priest bent down and whispered in her ear one last time. No one remembers your name. No one calls you in songs. No one holds your image in mind. Disappear like sand to the wind. And then they started filling the ground, one hand at a time. Slowly, she kept her eyes open, looking up at the sky. The stars were clear at first, then dim, then gone as the dust washed over her face. She didn't cry out. She didn't struggle. She just breathed, until her last breath was cut off by a clod of dirt that hit her mouth. No one erected a tombstone. No one buried her with any objects. She was not prepared for the afterlife, for they considered her unworthy of having a soul to be reborn. They left soon after. The night was still deep. The Nile still flowed. And where she lay, there was still the warmth of someone who had lived, someone who had a name, someone who had been someone's daughter, a man rejected by the world, but carries in his heart something that no one can take away, the awareness that he once existed. The next morning, the sun still rose, the Nile still flowed, and the villagers still prayed. No one mentioned her. No one asked where she had gone. Her name was never recorded in the temple registers, in the village chronicles, or on any of the stone walls. In the eyes of ancient Egypt, she had never existed. But one thing no one expected. They had not filled all the graves. The soil was shallow, and the strong desert night winds had whipped some of the sand from her face. She was still alive. She woke up not because of strength, but because her survival instinct kicked in. In that weak breath, she felt every speck of dust on her tongue, every ray of light passing through the cracks of the rocks. The smell of earth, the smell of blood, the smell of cold stone, and of unfinished death. No one came. No one saved her. But she was still breathing. With a last effort, she pushed aside the thin layer of dirt covering her face. Her hands, now skin and bones, clawed feebly at the sand. She had no desire to get out of the grave. She just wanted to sit up, to sit, to not die lying down. After an hour, or maybe half a day, she was sitting up. Ahead of her was a barren hill. Behind her was the Nile, as distant as a memory. She didn't know how much time she had left, but she knew this. No one was allowed to forget her. She followed the path, trudging toward a stone wall carved with the image of Anubis, not for help, but to carve her name. Using a piece of pottery she found, she scratched into the stone, not in proper hieroglyphics. She didn't know how to write them, but in her own personal symbol, the one she'd carved into the limestone of the village to mark her mother's water jar. One spiral, 2 diagonal strokes. That was her name, and anyone who had ever lived with her would recognize it. When her hands were bleeding, when the piece of pottery fell and could not be picked up again, she turned back, going down the other side of the hill, where there had been an entrance to an abandoned tomb. It was not a royal tomb, nor an aristocratic one, just a small, neglected niche, untended or unworshipped. But inside there was enough darkness, enough silence, and enough oblivion for those who had no one left. She crawled in, lying down beside a broken stone statue. It was Ta, the god of craftsmen, of rebirth, of rebuilding from ruins. Coincidence or fate? She didn't know. With a last breath, she pressed her hand to her stomach, then her forehead. A simple ritual, without any formality. But in her heart, she forgave. Not those who punished her, but herself, forever wishing for a quick death. And then she closed her eyes. She was not reborn in the scriptures. Her name was not recorded on the tablet of the dead. No one sang her farewell, but the stone wall was still there, with a small, simple symbol, carved in fingernails and blood. Years later, when archaeologists came to the site, they found a spiral and 2 crosses. No one could decipher it. It was not part of any writing system. They thought it was a meaningless sign. But somewhere in the darkness that still lingers in that deserted grave, a girl's voice whispers, "I once lived, and I left my name." People often think that history is something written in stone, in words, in giant tablets standing tall in the desert. But there are pieces of history that no one records. There are lives that are quietly erased from the flow of time, leaving no trace but a story that no one dares to tell. The girl, whose name no one knew, whose face no one remembered, was strangled from the collective memory of a civilization. But where she lay, among the cracked rocks and the roots that pierced the earth, her whispers remained, through the centuries. On nights when the desert wind blew in, it was said that if you put your ear to the stone walls of that abandoned tomb, you would hear someone singing softly, not an ancient song, but a lullaby, the same one her mother had sung when she was a child. A gentle refrain, meaningless, but strangely comforting. Children in the nearby village, though they had forgotten the old legends, still avoided the hillside at night. The elders said it was where the nameless one was buried, not because of fear of ghosts, but because the place carried a heavy sense of neglect, a reminder of the cruelty of order without love. A Ptolemaic scholar wrote in his diary, "A strange symbol was found near an abandoned tomb. It does not appear in any Egyptian writing system. Some say it is the mark of the cursed, but when one looks closely, one sees that it is not a curse. It is a plea to be remembered. That plea, not addressed to the gods, not for judgment or salvation, but for someone, anyone, someday to hear. And you, the person listening to this story tonight, might be that person. She didn't want glory. She didn't want justice. She didn't want her honor restored. All she wanted was for someone to know that she had been here, that she had been captured, that she had suffered, that she had resisted in silence, and that she had kept her name when the world had tried to erase it. What was her name? You can imagine. How old was she? You can imagine. But most importantly, she had lived, and she had not let cruelty define her. In a world where everything revolves around power, ritual, and fear of the gods, she has no weapon but a heart that retains its dignity. No magic but the will not to fade into darkness. And that in itself makes her different, makes her, in a sense, immortal. Tonight, as you prepare to close your eyes, if you hear the gentle rustling of the wind outside your window, remember, there's a soul that was once forgotten, but now someone is listening. A small voice, once buried in the sand, is now speaking again, because you gave her a place in your mind. No need for temples, no need for incense, just a moment of silence, and a whisper, "I hear you." She will smile in the dark, and then quietly disappeared, no longer imprisoned. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. A sad, dark, yet meaningful journey about survival, faith, and the last dignity that humans can retain in the midst of oblivion. Now close your eyes, let the gentle wind outside lull you into a deep sleep. If you dream, I hope you will see a field of purple lotus flowers where your soul is free. No more chains, no more darkness, just peace. Good night, and thank you for being a listener.